Our math adventure continues. Today we are doing something entirely new. We are going to work on something called percent of change. Now when we think of percent of change, it means we're taking an amount of change that happens between two numbers and we're comparing it to where we started, or the original amount. So for example, we can have a percent of increase or we can have a percent of decrease. The concept of how we form our ratio is exactly the same. So say we wanted to find the percent of increase going from 4 to 7.5. Well, remember the top of that ratio, that's my amount of change. So I've got to find out the difference between 4 and 7.5. When I use that word difference, it means subtraction. So if I take 7.5 and I subtract 4, I get 3.5. Now remember, we always are going to compare that to the original amount. So I have to reread my problem and I have to think, where did I start? Well, I started at 4 and then went to 7.5. Therefore, my original amount was 4. Now notice that sets up a ratio, and we can always divide those ratios in order to get a decimal. And once we have the decimal, we can change it to a percent. So if I take 3.5 divided by 4, I come out with 875 thousandths. Now in order to change it from that decimal to a percent, I simply have to move my decimal point 2 places to the right. So I'm going to move it once, twice. Now I'm going to keep that decimal point there, and I get 87 5/10, and then I just add my percent. So the percent of increase that happened from 4 to 7.5 was 87.5%. Now we can also calculate percent of decrease. So if I had a problem that looked like this, find the percent of decrease from 1,500 to 1,416. I use the exact same process. So first I have to find that difference between those two numbers, so I'm going to use subtraction. So when I subtract those two, I get 84. Now the key piece of this is, where did you start? What was your original amount? We need to choose the right starting point because that's the bottom of that ratio. Well, when I read this, I started at 1,500 and then I went to 1,416. Therefore, I have to put the 1,500 on the bottom. Again, I just have a fraction, and all I need to do is divide to get my decimal. So when I divide it, I get 0.056, but I don't want a decimal. I want the percent. So again, I'm going to move that decimal point 2 places to the right, and I get 5 6/10%. Sometimes though, they're going to ask the question in a different way. Sometimes they're going to say, well, then increase the number by a percent. Well, if I had that, I think to myself, whatever I'm finding, that's my new amount. And I'm just going to set up an equation for that. Now, where I start at 120. That represents 100% of my starting point. Then I'm going to go up by 75%. So that it means that I'm going to go up actually 175%. That beginning point of 100% is important. That's where we're starting. We're starting at the 120. Well, when I then change that percent to a decimal so I can calculate, remember you're going to replace that percent symbol with a decimal and move it 2 places to the left. I'm going to multiply 120 times 1 75 hundredths. When I do that, because I'm going by 1 first, that's my starting point, then I'm going to go up by 75 hundredths more. I come out with 210. So, and I expected it to be a big number because I was increasing. So if it had come out less than 120, I know that I probably did something wrong with that. The same thing applies if I was going to decrease a number. So if you decrease 35 by 60%, well, my new amount is going to be where I start, which is 35. That represents 100% of my beginning point. But now because I'm decreasing, I'm going to subtract by 60%. So 100% minus 60% means I'm going to take 40% of that number. Well, I'm going to change that percent to a decimal by moving it 2 places to the left. So I get 0.40, Now I can multiply. You can never multiply if you're in that percent form. You always have to change that percent to a decimal. So then I do 35 times 40 hundredths, and I get 14. And that answer makes sense to me because I knew it had to be smaller if I was going to decrease it, and 14 is smaller than 35. So that's a perfect way that we can calculate percent of change. It's actually relatively easy to do. The challenge is up to you. Good luck.